What if the confusion, grief, or identity shift you're experiencing isn't something to fix, but the initiation of your heroine's journey? In this episode of Sea of Radiance, I explore a powerful and often misunderstood stage of a woman's life, the inner descent that precedes profound personal transformation. American culture often pathologizes the emotional struggle that comes with significant life changes, rather than supporting women through these processes with mentorship, community, and rites of passage. In this episode, I reframe these periods of profound change as initiations into deeper purpose, wisdom, and power, and I offer you some ways to move through a descent with courage. Enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Sea of Radiance. I'm your hostess, Erin Pettis. And today I'll be diving more deeply into a topic I touched on with Jennifer Little in the first episode of the podcast. And that is the counterpart of the hero's journey for women, which I will call the heroine's journey. This process can be initiated by a significant external event, such as when you become a mother, go through a breakup or a divorce, or lose a loved one. These are some of the more tangible examples of identity shifts that can more easily be named and associated with a date of occurrence. But this often very painful journey into the depths of ourselves can also be instigated by something more elusive, something that we can't necessarily point to as the cause of our grief. So I also want to acknowledge these periods of life that cannot necessarily be traced to an event, but that may be just as excruciating and may last just as long as the grief of losing a beloved. Either way, when we endure a metamorphic descent as women, we're going within in order to meet and tend to parts of ourselves that are in need. In both the Sumerian myth of Inanna as well as the Greek myth of Persephone, there's a descent into the underworld, which is required to relinquish something of value to her, thereby undergoing a symbolic death of her former self, which permits her eventual emergence. And when she emerges, she's utterly changed. When we find ourselves in a stage of life in which we're in profound transition, it may or may not be voluntary. We as humans in this modern age have comforts and distractions in abundance, and we are quite resistant to change, especially when suffering is involved. So despair is often required to give rise to formidable change in our lives. We would generally choose to stay in our cozy nooks of predictability rather than descend into the unknown, where the outcome is uncertain, the path is unlit, and the journey may take a lot longer than we would like. So much courage is required of us to surrender when we are just feeling our way in the dark, so to speak, and moving through a period of loss of our former selves or our old identities before it becomes clear what's being asked of us and before our resurrection is complete. Actually, I don't think resurrection is the correct term because the version of you that will emerge following these stages will be so utterly distinct from the person you are now, the person who enters into that deep period of change. I personally went through a stage of metamorphic change after my first son was born. I was pregnant and in grad school at the same time and working and teaching and doing my research, writing my thesis. And 2 weeks before I graduated, our son was born, and we immediately moved across the country to a pretty grim shipbuilding town where I was suddenly a mom at home with a husband who was on call or at work over 80 hours a week. I had no family nearby. I didn't know anyone because we had moved for my husband's work training. And money was very, very tight. So every aspect of who I had been and my entire sense of self and purpose changed just overnight. And my support system was very far away. So even though I had always wanted to be a mother and I had no regrets about that, that complete identity shift was very, very difficult for me. So it can happen like that, where there were clear events and changes to which I could attribute my feeling pretty untethered. But when there's nothing you can point to as the precipitating event, like a divorce or move, etc., it could be that Pluto, which is the Roman equivalent of the Greek Hades, could be moving through a part of your astrological chart and bringing you to a point of descent into Hades, so to speak. And this is where Persephone went at the change of seasons. We go into the descent and sort of get stripped of that which we previously knew as our identifiers, almost like we're stripped naked of parts of us that we used to relate to as who we are, who we were. Those roles we played are or responsibilities we had that gave us our bearings. And then things get rearranged for us in a sense, and that rearrangement can be very uncomfortable as we're required to release old identifiers and probably to reacquire parts of ourselves that were abandoned in some way earlier in life. This necessitates an opening and a surrender to allow for the discomfort of the unfamiliar and of the unraveling. We may have a deep sadness that feels like it springs from eons or even lifetimes ago in this process. We're left with few options of supportive places to turn for guidance and advice when we go through periods like this. Unlike when our culture used to live more intergenerationally and we had grandmothers and aunties and elder role models or mentors we could talk to about these experiences to get their wise takes on what was going on, we don't necessarily have that now. In America now, if you're not part of a group of friends or some community where you can discuss what's going on and get feedback from women who've been in similar situations, then it sort of turns into you needing help from a therapist or a psychiatrist. And by virtue of seeking help like that, it can kind of feel more like it's a pathology that you need someone to help fix instead of a period of evolution in need of a rite of passage, in need of support of other women. This is a necessary evolution, but we don't honor or have ceremony around rites of passage really any longer in our American culture, with the exception of quinceañeras and bat mitzvahs. In the past, you could go through something difficult like this and know that it's a part of your evolution, that it's something most women in one way or another undergo as part of the changing seasons of life, and that your experience doesn't necessarily need to be pathologized. Perhaps you do need a helping hand and a community of women who preceded you down a similar path who would share their wisdom with you. While this is very much a personal, internal process, it could be very well served by being part of what I envision to be a large circle of multiple generations of women. I imagine looking around that circle into their faces as we each progress through the phases of our lives, knowing that those other women at various ages and stages are all there to support one another and to usher each other through the challenges of life as witnesses, as cheerleaders, as compassionate sisters. Our focus here on so-called independence in our country really does us a disservice when we're going through these stages of life. It can be called an initiation. I've heard it described as being stuck in a cave or feeling like you're down in a well, and even as being waterboarded in a fetid swamp. So if you've had this experience, you know exactly what I'm describing. And I imagine that if you didn't have assistance, that you might have wished for an understanding person to talk to. When we haven't yet reached a point in our development that we are able to have deep and real and honest conversations about the challenges in life, we can really feel alone when something like this takes us down. I think it's particularly difficult in society today because what we see are curated images of other people that seem not to be suffering. So we may not even talk to our closest friends about this, and we may not feel comfortable talking about it in a vulnerable, open-hearted way. Even when you have family and friends around you, what can happen is that because they care for you and simultaneously they're uncomfortable watching you change, they may try to pull you out of that state prematurely. But this is something that we have to go through internally. It's a personal journey. You will emerge from it if you stay the course. And if you're courageous enough to endure the changes that are taking place, you'll emerge with new gifts and a whole new connection to your soul and your purpose and your power. So if you find yourself in the midst of a personal transformation or significant shift in your life, I offer these journal prompts to help you. So first of all, know that you should write without editing or censoring yourself at all. Just let it flow. First, describe what you're feeling right now, all of it, all the emotions, all the feelings. And then explore which aspects of your identity and the roles that you play maybe dying. What's leaving your life? What are you laying down? What is your soul preparing for? Write about what the emergence of the new version of you may look and feel like. What gifts may be coming back with you. If you're not sure, just answer as if you knew for certain. I really hope you find this helpful. See you in the next episode.